There are moments in criminal history that never produce a body, never trigger a headline, and never leave a paper trail, yet they reshape entire cities. This was one of them. No gunshots, no threats, no violence at all. Just a room, a handful of men, and a decision made quietly behind closed doors. When the five families called an emergency meeting, it wasn't because of a war in the streets. It was because of one man they could not ignore. For years, Bumpy Johnson existed outside their structure, yet inside their calculations. He wasn't Italian. He didn't sit at their tables. He didn't answer to their hierarchy. And yet, nothing significant moved through Harlem without passing through his influence. Money flowed smoothly. Violence stayed contained. Most importantly, attention from the authorities remained limited. That balance made Bumpy useful, but usefulness has an expiration date. By the time this meeting was called, something had shifted. Expansion plans stalled. Expectations went unanswered. Decisions that once seemed automatic now required negotiation. The five families weren't facing a rival they could eliminate without consequences. They were facing a structural problem, a power center that didn't belong to them but couldn't be removed without destabilizing everything around it. This wasn't a debate about loyalty or respect. It was a calculation. Was Bumpy Johnson an asset that stabilized Harlem, or a variable that limited future control? The answer wouldn't be shouted. It wouldn't be argued publicly. It would be settled the way real power always settles disputes through consensus reached in silence. Inside that room, no one needed to mention Bumpy's name loudly. Everyone already understood what was at stake. One vote would not decide his fate directly. It would decide something far more important: whether the five families would intervene, adapt, or step back. And in organizations built on balance, stepping back can be the most powerful move of all. This is the story of that meeting. The arguments that were never recorded, the vote that was never documented, and how a decision made without violence changed everything that followed. For years, Bumpy Johnson had been something the mafia tolerated rather than challenged. He wasn't inside their system, but he didn't threaten it either. Harlem ran quietly. Profits moved without disruption. Police pressure stayed manageable. From the perspective of organized crime leadership, Bumpy represented a rare outcome in the underworld: stability without ownership. That stability was precisely why he eventually became a problem. The mafia's power model depended on expansion, not always territorial, but structural. Influence had to deepen, control had to tighten, and in Harlem, that process kept stopping at the same invisible wall. Deals could be discussed, percentages could be negotiated, but final authority never fully transferred. Decisions that should have flowed downward instead stalled, waiting on a man who wasn't supposed to be part of the chain. Bumpy didn't block expansion openly. He didn't issue ultimatums or challenge authority. He simply remained necessary. Local figures deferred to him. Disputes were resolved through his word. Violence stayed low not because of mafia enforcement, but because his presence made escalation unnecessary. From the outside, it looked cooperative. From the inside, it looked like dependence. That dependence raised an uncomfortable question inside the mafia leadership. What happens if Harlem answers to someone who doesn't answer to us? This wasn't about race or tradition, though both hovered in the background. It was about precedent. If one independent power center could exist peacefully outside the system, others might follow. The mafia didn't fear Bumpy's strength, they feared his model. A model where legitimacy came from results rather than hierarchy. Where influence was earned locally, not granted by a council. The problem intensified as federal attention increased across New York. Every independent actor was a liability. If pressure came down, who could be trusted to hold the line? Who could be managed, disciplined, or sacrificed if necessary? Bumpy didn't fit those categories. He was predictable but not controllable. By the time the emergency meeting was called, the issue was no longer Harlem itself. it was governance. The five families weren't asking whether Bumpy Johnson was dangerous. They were asking whether allowing him to continue unchanged weakened the very idea of centralized authority. And in organizations built on perception as much as power, that question alone was enough to force a closed-door reckoning. Bumpy had not challenged the council. He had done something far more unsettling. He had made it pause. No invitations were written. No locations were spoken aloud. When the five families convened, it happened the way real power always does, quietly, deliberately, and without witnesses. This was not a summit announced by messengers or enforced by urgency. It was a signal understood only by those who mattered. Be present, or accept the outcome without complaint. The room itself was unremarkable by design. No windows that could be watched, no phones that could be traced, no unnecessary movement. Men entered separately and spoke little at first. Seating followed no obvious hierarchy, yet everyone knew where influence sat. In gatherings like this, titles mattered less than history. Who had solved problems before? Who had prevented wars? Who had kept money flowing when everything else broke down? What made this meeting different was not who attended, but who didn't. Bumpy Johnson was not there, and yet his presence filled the room. Every argument circled him without naming him. Every pause acknowledged that the issue could not be reduced to a simple yes or no. This wasn't about punishment. It was about intervention. No one raised their voice. There was no need. In councils like this, emotion is a liability. Men spoke in fragments, references, and past examples. Harlem was mentioned without being described. Stability was discussed without being praised. Risk was implied rather than quantified. Each speaker knew that clarity was dangerous. The more precise the language, the easier it could later be used against them. The unspoken rule was simple. Nothing decided here could look like a decision. If action followed, it had to appear organic. If restraint prevailed, it had to seem inevitable. That required consensus, not enthusiasm, but acceptance. Silence mattered more than persuasion. When a point landed, no one rushed to support it. They let it sit. Let others weigh whether contradicting it was worth the cost. This was governance at its most refined. No enforcement arm, no paperwork, just a collective understanding of limits. And hanging over everything was a single concern: federal attention. Any move that disrupted Harlem risked inviting scrutiny none of the families wanted. Any move that left things unchanged risked admitting that someone outside the system had become indispensable. By the time the discussion slowed, the outcome was not yet clear, but the framework was set. Whatever happened next would hinge on one final question. Was it safer to act, or safer to leave things exactly as they were? That question would not be answered with words. It would be answered with a vote no one would ever record. Once the room settled into silence, the real work began. Not debate in the traditional sense, but positioning. Inside the closed circle of the five families, arguments were never presented as demands. They were framed as concerns, hypotheticals, reminders of past outcomes. Each man spoke, knowing that persuasion here depended less on logic than on what kind of future felt safest. One current in the room viewed Bumpy Johnson as a strategic risk, not because he was unstable, but because he was independent. Harlem functioned smoothly under him, but that smoothness came at a cost: no leverage. If pressure ever came down from above, there was no clear way to compel cooperation, no mechanism for discipline, no guarantee of alignment. To this faction, Bumpy represented a blind spot in an otherwise hierarchical system. And blind spots, they argued, were where institutions eventually got hurt. Another perspective pushed back quietly. Harlem, they noted, was calm precisely because Bumpy was there. No wars meant no headlines. No headlines meant less federal interest. Intervening without a clear upside risked breaking a balance that had taken years to settle. This side didn't frame Bumpy as an ally, but as a buffer. Someone who absorbed friction so the larger structure didn't have to. Removing or undermining him could invite instability the council would then be forced to manage directly. A third line of thinking cut across both positions. It wasn't focused on Bumpy at all. It focused on timing. Federal attention was rising across the city. Surveillance was expanding. Informants were becoming more aggressive. In that environment, any decisive action, whether cooperation or confrontation, carried risk. Sometimes, the safest move in a high-pressure moment is no move at all. Let the situation breathe. Let the outside forces shift first. What unified all three perspectives was restraint. No one argued for violence. That option never reached the table. Violence would create noise. Noise would invite scrutiny. And scrutiny was the one thing everyone in the room agreed had to be avoided. The question wasn't how to deal with Bumpy Johnson, it was whether dealing with him at all made sense right now. As the argument cycled, something subtle happened. The room began to lean not toward action, but toward containment through inaction. Not because it was ideal, but because it minimized exposure. And in councils like this, minimizing exposure often outweighs asserting dominance. By the time the last speaker fell silent, the contours of the decision were already forming. What remained was not persuasion, but confirmation, a final signal to determine whether the balance would tip or hold. There was no call for order, no formal procedure to follow. In gatherings like this, votes were never announced, they were felt. The five families didn't believe in tallies. Numbers created records, and records created risk. What mattered here was alignment. When the moment came, it arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, as the room settled into a stillness that meant discussion had reached its limit. No one asked the question out loud. No one needed to. Each man understood what was being weighed. Intervene in Harlem and assert control, or allow the existing balance centered around Bumpy Johnson to continue untouched. The decision wouldn't be framed as approval or rejection. It would be framed as permission to act or permission to refrain. The vote itself took the form of absence, a pause after a suggestion, a lack of objection when restraint was implied. In rooms like this, disagreement doesn't announce itself. It interrupts, and no one interrupted. One by one, the signals aligned not with enthusiasm, not with confidence, but with acceptance. The safest path forward was to do nothing that would force the system to reveal itself. That was the vote. It wasn't unanimous in belief, but it was unanimous in outcome. One holdout, one lingering doubt, could have tipped the balance toward action, but that doubt never materialized. Whether out of caution, calculation, or recognition of risk, the room settled on a shared understanding. Intervention would create more problems than it solved. What made the decision powerful was not its content, but its restraint. By choosing not to act, the council effectively acknowledged a reality it could not publicly admit, that Bumpy Johnson's position in Harlem was stable, functional, and inconveniently effective. The five families didn't legitimize him. They accommodated him, and in doing so, they preserved a wider equilibrium. No message was sent to Harlem. No emissary delivered terms. The outcome manifested indirectly. Plans quietly adjusted, expectations recalibrated, boundaries left deliberately vague. The absence of movement became the movement itself. Everyone involved understood the implication. Harlem would remain as it was, not because it belonged to the mafia, but because disturbing it carried too high a cost. In the end, the vote changed nothing on the surface and everything underneath. Power shifted not through conquest, but through recognition. A closed room decided to leave another power center standing, and that decision, invisible and undocumented, would shape the city far longer than any public show of force ever could. The outcome of the meeting wasn't delivered in words, but its effects rippled outward almost immediately. Plans adjusted, expectations softened. Certain conversations simply stopped happening. Harlem remained unchanged on the surface. Yet the five families had quietly redefined how they would deal with it, not as territory to be absorbed, but as a fixed variable, something to work around rather than control. What the council decided was not to endorse Bumpy Johnson, but to accept a reality they could not improve without increasing risk. That distinction mattered. Endorsement creates obligation. Acceptance creates distance. By choosing the latter, the five families preserved flexibility. They didn't bind themselves to Bumpy's future, nor did they tie their reputation to his decisions. They simply acknowledged that his presence solved more problems than it created. This kind of decision reveals how mature power structures actually function. Violence is a tool of last resort, not a default response. When systems are stable, disruption is expensive. Harlem under Bumpy was predictable. Money moved. Conflicts were contained. Federal attention stayed diffused. Removing him might have asserted authority, but authority that invites scrutiny weakens everyone involved. There was also a deeper implication. By not intervening, the council implicitly admitted that not all power needs to be centralized to be effective. Bumpy represented a decentralized model rooted in local legitimacy rather than formal hierarchy. The five families didn't replicate that model, but they learned to coexist with it. In doing so, they avoided creating a vacuum that would demand constant management. Nothing about this decision was permanent. Councils rarely believe in forever, but timing mattered, and in that moment, restraint aligned better with survival than dominance. The vote wasn't about surrender. It was about risk management at the highest level. For Bumpy Johnson, the meaning was just as clear even without a message. No move against him meant acknowledgement. Not respect in the traditional sense, but recognition of his role in maintaining balance. He didn't gain new power from the decision. He gained continuity. And continuity, in the underworld, is often the most valuable currency of all. This was the true legacy of the meeting. Not a shift in leadership, not a redrawn map, but a silent agreement to let a parallel system stand. A reminder that the most consequential choices are often the ones that leave no trace except in how long stability lasts afterward. No record of the meeting exists, no transcript, no photograph, no official acknowledgement that it ever happened. Yet its consequences were felt for years. That is how real power often moves quietly, without proof, without witnesses, and without the need to explain itself. When the five families chose restraint over intervention, they demonstrated something far more revealing than dominance: discipline. This was not mercy. It was calculation. The council understood that authority does not always need to assert itself to remain intact. Sometimes, the most effective decision is to recognize a boundary and leave it undisturbed. Harlem, under Bumpy Johnson, functioned without forcing the system to expose itself. That made it useful, and more importantly, it made it safe. What makes this moment endure is not what happened afterward, but what did not happen. There was no war, no betrayal, no dramatic shift of power. The city continued to operate along lines invisible to the public, shaped by agreements that would never be written down. And that is the illusion most people never see. History is not only made by loud events, but by decisions to remain silent. Bumpy Johnson never needed to sit in that room. He never needed a vote in his favor. His influence was already factored into the outcome. The meeting did not elevate him, it acknowledged reality. And in organizations built on perception, acknowledgement is often more powerful than enforcement. This story is not about gangsters or meetings or votes. It's about how systems protect themselves, about how power recognizes other power when confrontation would create more damage than control. The most dangerous moments are not the ones filled with violence, but the ones where men decide, calmly and collectively, to do nothing at all. Behind closed doors, one vote changed everything, not by action, but by restraint. And that choice, invisible to the outside world, shaped the balance of a city far longer than any gun ever could.